In this video, I'd like to show some metadata management enhancements that are coming in 2.0.8.6 and of course available in every build after that. If you've used Illuminated Cloud's bulk metadata management, whether that's deployment, retrieval, delete, you're almost certainly familiar with this dialog. It's the dialog that's displayed whenever you start a bulk deployment operation, whenever you try to retrieve metadata or delete metadata from an organization. There are different variations on it depending upon the operation, but in general, this is the dialog that is displayed. You may choose to work with the entire project or module. You may choose to work with a custom selection. You may choose to work with contextually inferred selection. But however it may be, it allows you to very selectively determine the subset of metadata for which you want to perform an operation. I'm going to go ahead for the sake of expediency and switch back over to context and show some of the new options that are available. Traditionally, Illuminated Cloud has automatically set the configuration settings for some of the deployment options, delete options, things like that. In particular, how errors or warnings are handled if they're encountered during a deployment or a delete, what level of testing should occur during a deployment, and of course, whether a deployment is intended to be a validation or check-only deployment, or whether it's actually intended to be committed to the server. So now there are explicit configuration options for each one of these. Let's just talk about them in turn. So the first two are closely related: ignore errors and ignore warnings. Traditionally, Illuminated Cloud would specify that errors and warnings should be ignored on deployment, which basically means that whatever metadata that could be deployed successfully to the organization is committed, and errors are reported for the others, and you would fix those errors and basically perform another deployment in order to make things whole. There are certainly situations in which you would want to make sure that this is an all or nothing or atomic type of operation. By default, that's required when you're deploying to a production class organization, but when you're deploying to a sandbox and you're deploying to a developer edition organization, effectively anything that's not production class, you can pretty much decide how you want this to behave. Well, now these are options that are available for selection here. By default, when you first upgrade to 2.0.8.6 or beyond, the values for these options will mimic the prior behavior, which is that ignore errors and ignore warnings will be checked. Similarly, the only way that you could have Illuminated Cloud perform a check-only deployment for you would be to use the as-you-type kind of edit-based validation. But now you can specify that you want a bulk deployment, could be all the metadata in your project, to be check-only by checking this check-only box. If checked, then things will not actually commit, but you'll get an idea of the state of and the quality of the metadata selected for deployment. You'll get errors back. You can obviously resolve those without any risk of potentially updating the target organization. And then you can specify the level of testing that should occur. Again, Illuminated Cloud would pretty much choose this based on the type of the target organization. If it's a production organization and Apex is being deployed, a certain level of testing has to occur if it occurs to the metadata API. Well, now you can actually specify the level of testing that should occur. If you choose default, it's going to use whatever the default testing disposition would be for that deployment to that organization. You can also specify that no test run should occur, which may not be valid for the type of deployment, in which case you get an error. You can designate that you want a specific subset of tests to be run. I'll show that in just a moment because there's more to that. You can designate that you only want local tests in the order to be run, which is really all tests for which source code is available. So not tests from installed managed packages, which are obfuscated. Or you can specify that you want all tests in the organization to run, which would include managed package tests, which is primarily useful if you're concerned about your metadata causing conflicts with the behavior of the logic from installed managed packages. If you choose Run Specified Tests, Illuminated Cloud will make available to you a selector for any of your Apex unit test run configurations. So you can choose one of these. All these options are retained. The selections are retained across deployments to the same connection. So if you continually do bulk deployments to the same connection, you won't have to repeatedly reconfigure this. If you don't see a test suite that you would actually want to use, you can just click this button and it'll bring up the run configuration editor, and you can configure a new run configuration. Note that all test configurations are omitted from this drop-down because that would be the equivalent of using run local tests. So in this case, we'll go ahead and run the shopping list test. We'll do this check only. I want it to roll back if there are errors or warnings, and so we'll go ahead and say deploy. And Illuminated Cloud will run the deployment. It will deploy, and then it will run tests. It will report status along the way if status is available. Using the native deployer, as you can see here, status is available. If you're using the CLI, currently status is not available. I'm evaluating whether I want to switch over to async deployment. It really comes down to whether repeated execution of the CLI has enough performance overhead that it would make sense to continue to allow it to just execute in the background. I'll have to determine what the trade-off is there. So that finished. It said that it actually validated versus deployed one-to-one components against connection demo in this amount of time. It says that it failed though because some of the tests actually failed. So 11 out of 13 passed. So if we open up the Illuminated Cloud problems view, we can actually go into the failing tests and actually be hyperlinked to the primary entry point of the failing test. If we want to see more details, we can click on the messages view. We can see what successfully deployed, and then we can actually see the hyperlink stack trace for each one of these failures, and we can click through and actually see each stack frame in the stack trace. So so you can see that you can actually get quite a bit of information, and it's actionable. If we go back into that dialog and I choose a different connection and it's a production class connection, so for example this, you'll see that options which are not valid for deployment to that type of an organization are not configurable. In this case, it's not possible to do a partial deployment to a production class organization where some things commit and some roll back. So it's just going to disable that, and that's going to run rolling back on any errors. So it'll automatically try to keep you from getting into a bad configuration state. Similarly, if you try to delete metadata, there are new options available. Ignore errors and ignore warnings are going to be similar to what you saw in the deployment dialog. And then there's another option, purge on delete, which effectively means when you delete this metadata, do you want it to be moved to the recycle bin, if possible, so that it can be undeleted if that was a mistake, or do you want it to be completely obliterated from the target organization? This is checked by default, which the idea is that you want to keep your target organization clean, but you can uncheck it and things will be moved to the recycle bin if possible. Same thing holds if I choose a production class organization. Then options which do not make sense against that organization are disabled and cannot be configured. So in this case, you cannot do an all or nothing type of deployment, same as with the deploy dialog, and you can't specify purge on delete. So hopefully this makes deployment, delete, management of your metadata using Illuminated Cloud against various types of organizations much more configurable, puts things much more under your own control. If you do find any issues, things aren't working as described, things aren't working as expected, certainly let me know. I'll be happy to investigate those and make things right. But hopefully these will be useful enhancements for everybody. Thank you very much for your time.